It's with great excitement that in several days we will begin the Yontiv of Sukkos, the festival of joy, Zman Simchasenu. The Torah tells us to dwell in Sukkos for 7 days so that all the generations will know that when we left Egypt, God placed us into Sukkos. Do you remember that? We go into the Sukkah. What are those Sukkos? And the Talmud says that the Sukkos were huts that were created for us in the desert to protect us from the elements. But the Talmud also says that the Sukkos also are clouds of glory. And what happened was that when we left Egypt, God enveloped us with these magnificent clouds of glory. And therefore, we dwell in the Sukkah, symbolic of those clouds of glory that surrounded us. We dwell in the Sukkah on the holiday of Sukkot. So Rabbi Elijah Vilna asks an obvious question. If the idea and the concept is God enveloped us in these clouds of glory when we left Egypt, so fine. So we should sit in a Sukkah Pesach time, because that's when we left Egypt. Why then do we celebrate the holiday of Sukkos and sit in the Sukkah to remember the being enveloped in the clouds of glory when we left Egypt? It's months later. And Rabbi Elijah Vilna explains so beautifully. Yes, the clouds of glory enveloped us when we left Egypt, but on the 17th day of the month of Tammuz, when we tragically, sadly sinned with the golden calf, God removed those clouds of glory. 40 days later was Yom Kippur, the 10th of Tishrei. God told Moses, I have forgiven the Jewish people. The next day, the 11th of the month of Tishrei, God commanded that Moses gather all of the Jewish people and tell them about the construction of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, and that they are to bring gifts and donations to make it happen. On the 12th and the 13th, there was this magnificent campaign that all the gold and silver and everything that was needed for the temple was actually brought by the people in only 2 days, to the point where Moses said, it's enough, we have enough. On the 14th day of Tishrei, that's when Bezalel and his team put together, they saw and they looked and they sorted all of the materials. On the 15th day of Tishrei, that's the day that the construction of the tabernacle began. And on that very day, the clouds of glory returned to once again envelop the Jewish people. So we sit in Sukkos. We go into our Sukkah to remember that on Sukkos, at that first year, we were again enveloped in the clouds of glory. What an amazing lesson. We transgressed. We worshiped the golden calf. We lost the clouds of glory, and then we repented. God brought the clouds of glory back. This teaches us. What do these clouds teach us? What do they symbolize? They symbolize God's love. They symbolize God's embrace. When we sit in the Sukkah, just like on Pesach, we eat the matzah to remember that God took us out of Egypt. On Sukkos, we go into the Sukkah. We are enveloped with this mitzvah to remember that God enveloped us with these clouds of glory even after we transgressed, when we slipped up with the golden calf. God loves us. God loves us eternally. And no matter what, God will never separate himself from the Jewish people. In the month of Elul, Elul stands for Ani Ledodi Vedodi Li. I am my beloved, and my beloved is for me. That is symbolized, that carries through Rosh Hashanah, carries through Yom Kippur, and is so glorified in the holiday of Sukkos, when we are enveloped by God's love and God's embrace. This is the story of our people. Yes, there have been times in our history, unfortunately, too many times, where we have slipped up. But God never leaves us, and God always comes back to us. God's embrace is always there. What a beautiful thought to think about when we enter, when we sit in the sukkah or sleep in the sukkah during the holiday of Sukkos. God's embrace, God's love. Ani Ledodi Vedodi Li. I am for my beloved is for me. A message of eternity. God says, Leman Yedu Dorosechem. I want every generation to know. Every generation, even in generations where it might seem that I am far away, I am there. I am with you. I love you, Jewish people. God, we love you. Have a beautiful and joyous Yontiv of Sukkos.